Hello class, and welcome to this lecture on aggregate demand and aggregate supply in our course on macroeconomics. To give you a roadmap of what we're going to discuss in this lecture, we're going to be developing a new model and essentially the last model of the course, which is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. In the last lecture, we derived aggregate demand from the aggregate expenditures model, and we will delve in a little bit more and talk about what aggregate demand is, how the aggregate demand curve shifts in the context of the model, what are the explanatory variables that could cause it to change. We'll talk about economic policy because this will basically give us an introduction into the final unit of the course, which is talking about monetary and fiscal policy. We'll then talk about aggregate supply. There are two types of aggregate supply curves that we will have in our model. The first one will be the long-run aggregate supply curve, and the second one will be the short-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve will more emulate what you're used to in the context of the traditional demand and supply model. The long-run aggregate supply model, the long-run aggregate supply curve still has its importance and relevance, and it helps us compare two major economic theories in macro. And then the last thing to talk about is long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. That is the ultimate goal in this economy, is to achieve that. That basically indicates that the level of the economy is acceptable and we're kind of doing all we can and operating at capacity. And then I'll finish class by doing a few examples with the ASAD model, drawing out some fluctuations and seeing how equilibrium can change and what type of considerations we can discuss that will kind of set the stage for our policy section of the course. So what is aggregate demand? So in the last section, we used the aggregate expenditure model. We found the macroeconomic equilibrium points where aggregate expenditures and GDP were the same. And those were operating under the assumption of a given price level. So if we plot the given price level and the corresponding GDP levels, we basically can plot those, connect the dots, and we have a curve that shows the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded by households, firms, and the government. We're going to talk about aggregate supply eventually, and what aggregate supply allows for us to do is to basically combine these two elements together to figure out where we're actually at in the economy, and then basically figure out, is it good enough? And if it's not good enough, what can we do to fix it? And if it's more than what we were expecting, what are the potential problems with that, and how can we correct those problems from occurring? So just to give you kind of a visualization of what we started with earlier in the course with regular supply and demand. Let me use a brighter color. So before we had regular old quantity and price for a specific market. So let's say this is the market for bananas because we're using a yellow pen. We had a downward sloping demand curve as usual. We had an upward sloping supply curve, and that intersection point gave us the corresponding price and the corresponding quantity. The problem now, we can't just do that because we have in the macroeconomy millions of different products, millions of different industries, and the prices for all of them are different, and the quantities are all different, and the actual value of all the products is different. So in order for us to actually assess the macroeconomy within the context of the supply and demand model that we've already talked about, we're going to have to change price to price level. So we've talked about CPI, GDP deflator, producer price index, other price levels, basically average prices of the goods and services in the economy based on different populations or different contexts. And so a price level is basically going to be one of those, or any one of those price levels that we believe is relevant is going to now be the indicator for price, where it's basically saying, on average, relative to a base year, how much more or less expensive are the prices in this current period of time versus the way they were in the base year. Gives us a little bit of a relativity fluctuation. So Difference between 103 and 105 is the percent change between 103 and 105, and so that would indicate those prices are that percentage higher than they were before. Now, instead of quantity just being a number of units of a specific good or service, we now have to focus on the value of those goods and services, which is why we calculated gross domestic product earlier in real GDP. So that will now become the x-axis. So y goes on the x-axis, very confusing, but remember y represents GDP. So what our new model is going to look like is we're going to have price level, whichever one we believe is relevant or appropriate. And we're going to have y down here. So again, y represents real GDP. This could represent CPI for an example. And then basically we'll have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve derived from those macroeconomic equilibrium points we found in the aggregate expenditures model. Later on, we'll have aggregate supply. We'll have two aggregate supply curves. We'll have long-run aggregate supply and we'll have short-run aggregate supply. And those two will help us determine our overall macroeconomic equilibrium in the economy. And we'll be able to benchmark it with long-run aggregate supply to see if we are where we anticipated we would be at this point in time based on the characteristics and the resource and the technology and the abilities of our workforce that we have at that current moment in time. So why is the aggregate demand curve downward sloping? This is just like when we talked about demand earlier in the course. The regular demand curve was downward sloping as a result of two factors. The first one was the income effect, and the income effect is the change in quantity demanded given a change in price affecting the purchasing power of the consumer that's buying the product. The same is relevant here. So we now have two income effects. We have the wealth effect, and we now have the interest rate effect. So the wealth effect is basically just saying, okay, how many assets do I have? What is my level of income at this certain point in time? So it's not just the income effect, because you could also have savings and investments and assets and stuff like that. So the accumulation of wealth that I have, income, assets, etc. When prices change in the economy, how does that affect my purchasing power? Exact same concept as before. In a second, I'll talk about it in more detail in terms of instead of it now just being, okay, as simple as, well, that makes sense, just like it did with demand, that should, we have to look at it within the context of the components of GDP so we know exactly what these effects are impacting. Because when it comes to talking about policy, or it comes to coming up with an idea to solve some sort of economic problem, you want to know what your policy is going to affect. Is it going to affect firms? Is it going to affect individuals? Is it going to affect the government? Is it going to affect international trade? Whatever it may be, you need to know how it's going to affect it. The second category is the interest rate effect. So changes in the price level will affect the cost of borrowing. So that's going to effectively change consumption and investment. So the interest rate effect is also part of that income effect. It's affecting your purchasing power. Now, the wealth effect speaks to the purchasing power of the assets and the things that you could buy with that. The interest rate effect is speaking to the purchasing power that you have in terms of your credit worthiness and your ability to take out money that is beyond what you currently have in your asset pool. We also had the substitution effect, and the substitution effect is the change in quantity demanded as a result of a change in the price of the product that you're measuring, because of the fact that when you change the price of the product, it's now more or less expensive than the potential substitutes. Now, it's different in the macroeconomy because we can't just be like, well, I'm just trading in the iPhone for a Samsung Galaxy phone. It's more so that I am now going to be trading in my goods that are made in America with something else, because we can't substitute an American product with an American product in the context of macro. Both will count positively towards GDP. So where the substitution effect comes in is in international trade. So when prices change It'll, in America or the domestic country, it's going to affect how foreign investors or consumers view the value or cost of the products in their own country relative to this country. And so that will affect the net exports. So if it's cheaper, then other countries might think, okay, well, if it's cheaper there, I might buy it from them. And if it's more expensive here, Americans might think, you know what, it might be cheaper to buy it somewhere else. And that has the same effect that you had before. So diving into a little bit more detail, the wealth effect is going to distinctly affect consumption because it is affecting the household's purchasing power. So if you increase the price level, so again, this is all of the goods in the economy that a typical consumer would purchase. If you increase the price level, that's going to decrease the overall purchasing power with that constant level of wealth, which is going to decrease the quantity demanded for consumption goods, which is going to decrease the overall quantity demanded for GDP, since consumption is a component of GDP. Likewise, if you decrease the price level, that'll increase the purchasing power of the household, which will result in an increase in the quantity demanded of their consumption goods, which will result in an overall increase in the quantity demanded of GDP. Now remember, this is just a movement along a given aggregate demand curve, so we're just moving from, say, here up to here. We're not shifting the curve in any way, shape, or form at this moment in time. We are just moving along it. Moving on to the interest rate effect. So the interest rate effect speaks more to how much the household will have to borrow. So if they're buying a house or if they're buying a car, they're making some sort of big purchase where they want to be able to borrow the money because they don't necessarily have all of the wealth assets to purchase it outright at the moment. Or maybe they do, but they just don't want to have to drain their asset pool or have no savings or anything like that. So they borrow. But if it's more expensive for the product, so if prices are more expensive, then that means that the amount of money that the individual consumer or firm will have to borrow to complete that project is going to be more expensive. If the prices are more expensive and the borrowing baseline is higher, then that's going to basically disincentivize firms from investing, because now their budget is higher and maybe they can't afford it on that budget, or some individuals or firms can't afford the new budget at the new prices, so they cancel the project or they don't feel like doing it anymore. And then likewise for households, if it's more expensive to borrow, then it's going to decrease the quantity demanded for consumption loans for cars and houses. On the other hand, if you decrease prices, then the overall amount of money that needs to be borrowed is less, which puts upward pressure on consumption and investment quantity demanded, because of the fact that now, because it's less money I have to borrow, I might be able to fit that loan into my budget. It might be more affordable in terms of the monthly payment. Maybe I can afford that mortgage, or maybe I can afford that monthly car payment now because the amount of money I have to borrow is less. Ceteris paribus, and that results in an increase in quantity demanded of GDP. So again, we're just moving along the given demand curve for this example. Just like before, we're still staying on the same initial demand curve. We're not shifting anything. We're going to do that, but not at this moment in time. These are just that's the income effect combined with wealth and interest rates. That's the income effect for the economy. The next one is the net export effect, and this is essentially the substitution effect. And so please bear with me with the arrows and the long text. There's a lot going on, and I think it's important that we know everything that's going on. So the reason why net exports and international trade looks complicated to read is because it is complicated in general. You not only have to factor in how the domestic country feels in terms of their components, but you also have to figure out how the rest of the world feels about this approach too. So if we had a closed economy, there wouldn't be any substitutes, but if we have an open economy like most of the world is, then you are going to have an opportunity for substitution. And that's the reason why some countries want to impose tariffs, because they don't want individuals purchasing goods elsewhere because of the fact that it hurts domestic businesses. But assuming that we have open borders and there's no necessary tariffs, or the tariffs aren't enough to make a significant impact on the overall price of the product for a foreign good, or vice versa, if there's an increase in the price level in the domestic country, well, that means ceteris paribus, the foreign good hasn't changed its price, so it's now less expensive relative to the higher priced domestic good. If foreign goods are less expensive, then that's going to increase the quantity demanded for foreign goods, not only by the foreign institutions, but by us as the domestic country, which is going to put upward pressure on the quantity demanded for imports, which is negative in GDP. On the other hand, it's going to decrease the demand for domestic goods, not only for ourselves, but also for people in other countries who might have been like, well, I was going to buy that domestic country or American good, but now that it's cheaper in Indonesia because the prices went up in America, then I'm just going to buy the Indonesian version and import the Indonesian version, which puts a downward pressure on exports in the United States. So if you have an increase in the negative and a decrease in the positive, then you're going to have an overall negative value, which is a decrease in the quantity demanded for GDP. So the reason why there's all those steps is because you have to think through all of those steps. I don't just put this here because I think you need to read a lot. It's more so that you really need to understand all of the inner workings and nuances. So even though aggregate expenditures model is kind of a means to an end to derive this model, all of the stuff we talked about with the determinants and things that would affect aggregate expenditures like taxes and interest rates and expectations and things like that, all of that is going to be relevant here. So it's definitely something to keep in mind and make sure that you know all of those components, because as we'll see, the model isn't that complicated in terms of its visuals and aesthetics, but there's a lot going on that can cause the curve that we have there to shift in both directions essentially at the same time due to competing interests. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand what's going on, you won't really be able to glean any information from the model. So it's very important to know all these steps. If we decrease the price level, on the other hand, then basically that means that foreign goods are now more expensive relative to the cheaper prices in America or the domestic country. And that's, as a result, going to increase the quantity demanded for domestic goods, both by our own citizens and also from foreign entities who are looking to save money. So that's going to put positive pressure on exports, which is a positive on the positive. And since foreign goods are now more expensive, that means that the domestic country is going to be less interested in purchasing those foreign goods. So that's going to put downward pressure on the negative, which makes the negative smaller, and the positive, when the positive bit is bigger and the negative is smaller, that means that there's going to be an overall positive increase in the quantity demanded for GDP. So again, we're still just sitting on that same aggregate demand curve as before. So again, just moving along the curve. No shifts yet. We're about to get to those. But the net export effect is just like the substitution effect before. So, of course, the demand curve, or the aggregate demand curve, is going to shift. Previously, we had the regular old demand curve shifting because income changed, because prices of substitutes changed, prices of complements changed, tastes and preferences changed, population and demographic sizes changed, and expectations of the future changed. So a couple of those variables are going to be very relevant here, but with a different application. But overall, the demand curve is going to shift just like the aggregate demand curve is going to shift, just because, again, if these variables that are changing are not endogenous on GDP, they're exogenous factors like interest rates and things like that, then you can't visualize that because you're changing on the same given aggregate demand curve, because you're changing the underlying assumptions of that curve. And when you change the underlying assumptions of that curve, you get a new curve. So the major variables that we're going to focus on in terms of shifting the aggregate demand curve are changes in government policy. So really the last unit of this course focuses on the two government policies that are listed on this slide: monetary policy and fiscal policy. So I'll give you a brief run through of what those are in this lecture, and then we'll dig into a lot more detail in the subsequent lectures about those topics specifically. We'll also talk about changes in expectations in households and firms. So you could look at this in terms of like the expected future prices of before, or when we were talking about aggregate expenditures, when there's expectations of profitability and expected future income. That's really what we're talking about with those variables. And then lastly, changes in foreign variables. So the thing about monetary and fiscal policy that's funny is that taxes and interest rates were a factor in consumption and investment changing in aggregate expenditures. And essentially, monetary and fiscal policy are going to target those two things to have impacts on consumption and investment. So we could put interest rates here, we could put taxes here, but since they're basically going to be controlled on a massive scale by these policies, these discretionary policies, we just focus on the policy, because you'll see the same effect whether I approached it separately or with policy. So, and then the last one is going to be changes in foreign variables. So these are going to be the same foreign variables we talked about changing and affecting net exports in the aggregate expenditures model. So exchange rates, growth rates, and prices. And these are not necessarily saying that everything is changing. It's saying that like relative between the two countries or the rest of the world and America or the domestic country, is exchange rate higher or lower, growth rates higher or lower, prices higher or lower in those countries. So again, prices in America or the domestic country changing is going to affect the net exports in terms of this given aggregate demand curve. But if we change the price of goods in the rest of the world, then that's not something that's built into our model, so we're going to end up shifting the curve. So just a quick recap: monetary policy is going to be controlled by a central bank. So the United States has a central bank known as the Federal Reserve. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail in the money and monetary policy lecture after this one. That one's on deck. And that really is focusing on controlling the money supply and interest rate. So I'm going to give you a rundown of how it works here, but it might not make sense now, but it'll make a lot more sense when we get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty details about how money works and how interest rates are affected by the money supply and how we measure it. Fiscal policy is focusing on government spending expansions or contractions and changes in tax policy. So increasing taxes, decreasing taxes, stimulus packages, infrastructure bills, all of that falls under the umbrella of fiscal policy. So what is fiscal policy? So fiscal policy is going to be controlled by the government. And the way they're going to affect this is through government spending and taxes. So there are two types of policies that we can focus on, and we will focus on in this course. The first one is expansionary policy. And the goal for an expansionary policy, so it's hard to kind of talk about it in isolation right now because you wouldn't even know whether or not an expansionary policy or contractionary policy is useful without the aggregate supply there to serve as a benchmark. But operating under the assumption that the economy needs expansionary boosts, then the two options that the government has if they want to take control of it is increase government spending. What the increasing government spending doing, we'll learn about crowding out, that kind of mitigates some of this. But overall, Increasing government spending is going to have a multiplier effect. So we talked about the multiplier effect in the aggregate expenditures discussion. And so what's going to happen is they're going to increase their government spending. It could be a transfer payment initially, so that might not increase G initially, but if it's just a overall spending for goods and services, that's going to increase G right away. So let's say $50 billion is passed by the government in terms of boosted spending. Well, that $50 billion initially goes to the goods and services compensation for whatever is being produced for the government. And then that goes in the pockets of the households and then that or the firms, and then either the firm reinvests that money or the households spend that money at the rate of the marginal propensity to consume, and then you have more production that's coming as a result of that. And it cycles through and it cycles through until all that money is saved up. But overall, you're going to get an increase in aggregate demand from all of that. It's just going to be a bigger shift in AD than just the initial spending that occurs. Likewise, you could cut taxes. So if you cut tax rates for both households and firms, then you're going to get a bump in consumption and investment. The argument is sometimes to cut corporate taxes because of the fact that it will increase investment, and with their higher profit margins, they'll hire more workers or they'll pass higher wages off. But as we've seen time and time again in the 80s and even in 2017 through 2019, a lot of those corporations just siphon that money over to shareholders and stock buybacks. So it didn't really create economic activity. It just created profits for individuals that were already doing pretty well. So the trickle-down economics is very controversial. I'm not necessarily a fan or supporter of it, but I'm not one to get mired in the kind of policies of it. I understand the economic logic behind it, and theoretically, if the money was actually used to hire new employees or increase wages, it would trickle down to increases in consumption. So as we'll learn, particularly when we talk about monetary policy in a future lecture, that a lot of these policies are only effective if all of the steps that we talk about come to plan. So the reason why all these arrows are here is very important to understand, because if someone doesn't do their job or something doesn't go in the order it does, because when we talk about monetary policy, economic activity only increases from lower interest rates if banks are lending the money out. So if the banks aren't lending the money out, then there is no economic activity happening. Interest rates could be 0 or negative 20%. If no one is lending the money, then the money won't be lent, and no economic activity benefits from it. So here it was, if the firm doesn't share that corporate tax cut with the employees and society, then it doesn't provide any benefit. But if you give it to households in some way, shape, or form, whether it's indirect through corporate cuts or directly through personal tax cuts, then it's going to increase consumption, and there could be a multiplier, or not could, but there will be a multiplier effect, just like with the government spending increase. But both of those increase aggregate demand. And we'll revisit this later when we talk about fiscal policy distinctly. Contractionary policy, the goal there is to cut inflation. So when we talk about aggregate supply, we'll see a time in which contractionary policy might be useful. Typically, it comes at a time when we are at a level of full employment or beyond full employment. So typically at those points, there's upward pressure on prices and wages, and there isn't a lot of economic growth happening because we're already at capacity. So the government or the policymakers that be do a trade-off and decide, you know what, the economy is not really going to grow much anyways, so we would rather be able to control for prices right now with the same kind of range of economic activity, rather than let prices get out of control, which can trigger stagflation or a double bad, as the Orwellians would say. recession that could occur as a result. So, contractionary policy, the way you would implement that is the opposite. You cut spending when you have this multiplier effect in the other direction. If you cut spending, it cuts G, cuts C and I, because there's less of that money from the government projects cycling through, and you have a reduction in aggregate demand. And then lastly, when you increase taxes, well, that gives households less disposable income, so they're going to generally spend less. And if you increase taxes for firms, then they essentially will cut the level of production to try and maintain profit maximization, which is something that you would talk about in microeconomics in detail. Moving on to monetary policy. So again, this will kind of be pretty convoluted right now, but I think it's important to bring it up now so you have it within the context of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And then when we revisit it later, hopefully you've had it kind of a first glance at it, a first look at it. So then when we go through it again in more detail, all of the little steps make sense to you. And when we see case studies and examples of times where it didn't go according to plan, you can kind of pick out the steps in the chain that didn't go as you would intend for them to. So monetary policy is more indirect. It's controlled usually by a central bank in the corresponding country that is being analyzed. So in the United States, our central bank is the Federal Reserve. It was established a little over 100 years ago for a different reason. But mainly these days, the reason why people look to the Fed is in terms of their economic policy undertakings. So the way that they can undertake control in the economy is through money supply effects, and by virtue of money supply effects, changing interest rates. So expansionary and contractionary policy, the purposes for them are the same in monetary as they are for fiscal. Expansionary monetary policy focuses on, typically there are more than one way to do this. There's multiple ways to do this, but this is the one that's more frequent and more simple to understand. Well, the other ones might be simpler to understand, but they don't really get implemented very often, so there's no point in really spending a lot of time talking about them. So the real one is through what's known as open market operations. And open market operations are basically the Federal Reserve or the central bank decides to participate in the open market economy. Now, they don't necessarily buy stocks. Like, they're not like, I'm going to go buy Amazon and Google and profit and try to be a rich corporation. They're more focused on facilitating stability in the economy. Their goal is to maximize employment, keep prices stable, and maximize economic growth through the one tool that they have. So instead of them buying stocks and stuff, they participate in the economy by purchasing and selling bonds or securities. So earlier in the course, we talked about how securitization occurs, why it's beneficial. It provides more flexibility and liquidity in the market. More people are willing to invest, and that helps promote our long-run growth, as we talked about when we talked about long-run growth. So when they buy securities, what that's going to do is it's going to inject money into the economy, because when they buy the security, if you remember from before, the security is an IOU. So it's a transferable financial instrument, but it doesn't really give you money to buy stuff with at that point in time. So if you get a savings bond from your grandparents, I don't know if grandparents do that these days, but when I was younger, I got a U.S. savings bond, and I think it didn't mature for like 15 years, and it wasn't even worth that much. But you had to wait the 15 years, and then when the 15 years in, then the Treasury would pay you the principal amount plus some interest coupon payment that was decided when you issued, or when the bond was issued, the day it was issued. So until that day came, the only way I could get money for it was I had to trade it away. So like, I could have still went to the bank and sold it to them, but they wouldn't give me the full value of it because it hadn't matured yet. And so, but until I actually did something with that, there was no money that I could actually buy with it. I had to go to the bank and exchange it. I couldn't go to like the grocery store or a like electronics store and be like, hey, I want to buy a computer or some bananas with this bond. So when they buy securities, that essentially is injecting money into the market and pulling away the IOUs and paper that doesn't really allow for you to purchase goods and services with it. So when that happens, that means there's more money, so that would increase supply for the money. And when you increase supply, that puts downward pressure on prices at equilibrium. And since interest rate is effectively the price of borrowing, that's going to lower the price, and that's going to lower interest rates. And when interest rates are lower, we talked about how that affects consumption and investment. If it's cheaper to borrow, then you're more likely to borrow and invest. So if that happens, then you have an increase in aggregate demand. So that's the goal. But really, in order for the lower interest rates to have any effect, there had to be someone loaning the money at that interest rate. So if it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen, and there won't be this growth that is theoretically going to happen. And then we have contractionary policy, which is the opposite. So instead of the Fed throwing money at you for your bonds and sitting on them and letting them mature, they take all those IOUs, flood the market with them, and they suck basically like a vacuum. It's like a bond vacuum where they're like pulling all the money out of the economy. So like think about that like money machine, like basically like the money machine with the like blowing money and you're trying to grab it. That's like expansionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy is basically someone comes in with a shop vac and scoops up all the money that's left over at the bottom of the money booth after you've had your 20 seconds in it and you've been ushered out of it. Basically, they're flooding the market with those bonds and sucking the money out of the economy. And when that happens, there's less money. When the supply of money goes down, well, if supply goes down in general, price goes up. And if our measurement of price is interest rates, then that means our interest rates are going up, which is going to decrease consumption and investment borrowing. So that results in a reduction in aggregate demand. So again, a decrease in aggregate demand is going to be represented by a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. An increase in aggregate demand is going to be represented by a rightward shift of the demand curve, and I can visualize that in a little bit. So moving on to talking about expectations of households and firms. So again, you can look at this kind of a little bit like tastes and preferences. You could kind of look at it in terms of expected future prices. But effectively, if firms think that they have higher expectations and positive expectations about their profitability in the future, if individual consumers think their wages are going to consistently rise or good jobs are going to be available, or their expected future income is going to go up because they've got higher education and they're going to get a higher return on their investment and get a promotion, then typically you see households spending more when they believe that the money's coming, and firms are going to be investing more into the future because they want to ramp up and make sure they have the capacity to produce the goods and services to the level that will maximize their profits as the way they're forecasting them. So those will put upward pressure on consumption and investment and increase aggregate demand and shift that curve out to the right. On the other hand, if there are bumps in unemployment or people are getting laid off from their jobs or they're taking pay cuts or sales are down in the economy and the firm is having to hunker down and make sure that that they stay financially solvent, then typically the firm is going to cut back production, cut back on their investment in future inventories, expansion, and households will probably tend to save more and spend less. Well, if that's happening, then consumption and investment are falling and you have a decrease in your aggregate demand. If you want to look at consumer expectations, there is an estimator done by the University of Michigan. So the University of Michigan releases what's known as the Consumer Sentiment Survey every single month. So I have a link to the Federal Reserve Economic Database link that will give you a graphical kind of historical view of consumer sentiment. So it's an index just like CPI or any sort of inflationary or price level index. So really the value in it comes from the comparison to the previous time period or to a base period or base year. And then every month when the University of Michigan releases the most recent level of consumer sentiment information, the top link is where you would find that. And then last but not least, net exports and foreign variables are significant impacts on, or excuse me, have significant impacts on aggregate demand, mainly because of the fact that if we're changing foreign variables instead of changing domestic variables and seeing how the change in domestic variables changes the balance, that was capable of being factored in and packaged into a given aggregate demand curve. But when you change the foreign variables, which have no relationship to the GDP of the domestic country, so that's full-on exogeneity right there, then when those variables changes the underlying assumption of the aggregate demand curve, and as a result we end up shifting the curve in one direction or the other. So when we talk about the price level increases, that kind of speaks to the price of a substitute changing like we did with regular demand. So if the price level is increasing in the rest of the world, that means that domestic goods are now less expensive. And if domestic goods are less expensive, then the demand both by the domestic country and foreign countries in the rest of the world, the demand for those domestic goods goes up. Demand for the foreign goods goes down. So that means that if there's an increase by the rest of the world for our goods, the domestic goods, exports are going to rise. And if there's a decrease in demand for foreign goods by ourselves, then that's going to decrease the level of imports. And if the positive is getting bigger and the negative is getting smaller, so remember exports are positive, imports are negative, exports are going up, positives getting bigger, imports are negative, imports are getting smaller, then that's going to result in an increase in net exports overall, increase in the trade balance, and that's going to result in an increase in a shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve. Earlier in the course, I talked about the relationship between the value of the dollar and net exports. So I had a Fred graph that showed recession bars, and typically during times of economic recession in the United States, there's an improvement to the trade balance. It doesn't make us net exporters. We're still net importers by a significant margin. But the margin diminishes. And the reason why that happens is because during recessions, typically the value of the dollar decreases. Part of that's because of the fact that typically during recessions, the United States engages in expansionary policies. So like if the Federal Reserve is flooding the market with money and liquidity to try and lower interest rates to stabilize the economy, that's going to result in more money supply, which is going to put downward pressure on the value of the dollar because there's holding the amount of euros constant, holding the amount of yen constant. If we are printing more money effectively, that's whether it's literally printing more money or the term of art used for when the Federal Reserve engages in expansionary monetary policy, which is not literally printing money. It just means that they are basically buying up securities and putting money in the market. So please be mindful of that. Typically, that's going to put downward pressure on the value of the dollar. So if the value of the dollar is lower, that means foreign countries could get a higher quantity of dollars with their same quantity of currency as before. And if the prices in the United States are held constant, so like let's say something costs $3, but the exchange rate of a euro to a dollar goes from $1.10 per euro to $1.60 70 per euro. Well, now euro holders are going to get a substantially higher level of purchasing power for that fixed price good in America. And so as a result, then foreign holders of currency, or holders of foreign currencies, excuse me, will then come to America or purchase American goods because they have a fixed price, but effectively they're cheaper because I can get more dollars per euro or yen or yuan or any other currency or pound relative to before. If the price hasn't changed, then that means it's cheaper for me. And if it's cheaper for me, I'm going to buy more of that cheaper good, which puts upward pressure on exports, downward pressure on imports, because we can't afford to purchase foreign goods because our purchasing power is less. So even if the price of the good is the same in, say, Thailand, if the dollar is weaker relative to the baht than it was before, then now the things in Thailand are more expensive, and that puts downward pressure on import purchases. So even though the slide is talking about increases in the value of the dollar, I'm talking about decreases in the value of the dollar, so the relationship will be the opposite as to what is being shown on the slide. If the value of the dollar decreases, that puts upward pressure on exports, downward pressure on imports, which puts an increase in aggregate demand. If the value of the dollar appreciates relative to foreign currencies, then the opposite will happen. We'll have more purchasing power in those countries, and then we'll buy more stuff from them, and then imports go up, exports go down, and then we have a negative change and a shift to the left in aggregate demand. Last, we talk about growth rates. So this one's a little strange, and I talked about this with aggregate expenditures. There's a level of endogeneity here because we're talking about growth in GDP, and GDP is measured on our graph. However, foreign improvements or lack thereof to GDP is not measured on our graph. We are only measuring U.S. or domestic GDP. So foreign GDP growth rates are not, which makes it exogenous again. So if foreign countries are growing at a rate faster than the United States is, then that means that there's going to be an increase in exports faster than the imports rise. So if the United States and the rest of the world are both growing, then exports and imports will both go up. So if you want to figure out whether or not net exports is going up or not, you have to look at the rate in which they're growing. Because if they're both growing, they're both going to be bigger numbers in the next time period, but you want to know which number is going to go up faster. Are exports going up faster, or are imports going up faster? And so if exports are going up faster than imports, that's a result of the growth in the rest of the world being faster than the growth in the United States. So if the rest of the world is growing on average at 4% per year, and if the United States is growing on average at 2.3% per year, well, then the exports are going to grow by 4%, the imports are going to grow by 2.3%, assuming just a constant growth rate across everything consistently, which is going to mean that exports are growing faster, so that's going to be a bigger number than the net change in imports, which means that we're going to have a positive change in net exports, which is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So that one's a little complicated, but if you think about it a little bit, or just kind of like draw a little graph, or kind of just think about, so the way I like to think about it with the growth rates, it's like which arrow is getting bigger faster. So if exports, so if the rest of the world is growing faster, then that means the green exports arrow is growing faster than the red exports arrow, which means that this is bigger than this, and so we end up with a positive in net export changes. Now, if it was the other way around, then we would have a negative. But basically, that's the way you can kind of approach understanding this. So just to recap how aggregate demand is affected, basically, if there's an increase in interest rates, whether it be because of monetary policy or not, if it's more expensive to borrow money, people are going to borrow less, which results in a shift to the left of the aggregate demand curve. If the government, whether it's through expansionary fiscal policy or just a new budget that expands expands purchases, well, then that's going to increase G, and that's a component of GDP, and that's also going to cycle through in terms of consumption and investment, and that's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Now, if there's an increase in taxes, well, that leaves households with less disposable income. It also results in a lower level of consumption. And if firms have to pay higher taxes, that's going to affect their budgets, which is going to reduce their level of investment. So we shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. If basically both. If households think that there's a positive impact on their future incomes and they have high consumer sentiment, then we can usually expect that to have a positive effect on aggregate demand, and the curve would shift to the right, ceteris paribus. So again, all these are ceteris paribus, holding everything else constant. If firms think their expectations of future profitability are going to go up, then they're also going to increase their investment spending as well. And then lastly, if the rest of the world, if the domestic GDP, so this is the opposite of what I said in the last slide. Basically, if the growth rate of US GDP is faster than the rest of the world, then what that implies is that our exports are going to go up at a rate faster than our imports are going to go up at a rate faster than our exports, which is going to result in a net negative change. Oops. I wanted to use red there. A net negative change in our net exports. So in order for this model to make sense, and for some of the things that I talked about with economic policy to make sense, we need to combine supply with demand, just like we did earlier in the course. But in order for us to understand that model, we have to understand the underlying assumptions of supply. And so supply effectively is going to have two curves, and that's going to help us understand the relationship between what's known as the Keynesian model and the classical model. So there are going to be two supply curves. The first one is going to be the long-run supply curve, and that's going to be vertical. The reason why it's vertical is it's basically going to be a benchmark. So I've used the term benchmark a couple times in this lecture. And the reason why I'm doing that is because of the fact that it is a benchmark. It's basically indicative of full employment. It's indicative of our potential real GDP. So this, if you wanted to find out what the actual level of this is, it's forecasted by the Federal Reserve, and I'm sure other entities provide estimates of it, but the one that I mainly focus on is the one that's available publicly through FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database. And so they basically forecasted out 10 years in the future. So based on current levels of human capital and technological innovation, where will we reasonably expect our level of GDP to be if we were operating at full employment and at capacity where everyone was working kind of their normal work week or work hours a year in the future, 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future. And that's supposed to be indicative of what's known as the classical model in macroeconomics. And then we'll have a short run one, which will resemble a traditional supply curve that you saw in a regular market, upward sloping. And we'll talk about the assumptions that allow for that to happen. And that will represent the short run and effectively the Keynesian theory in macroeconomics. So again, the classical theory is going to be represented by the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, that's not to say that the Keynesian theory doesn't believe in the long run or anything in the classical model. It just speaks to the fact that most of our analysis isn't concerned with when times are good or theoretical futures, because we may never get there, or when we do get there, it's only for a fleeting moment, and then we're back into a state of economic fluctuation. We have business cycles. Talked about business cycles. So Keynesian theory agrees that the long-run representation of the vertical supply curve makes sense, but oftentimes we're not in that state. And so Keynes famously stated, in the long run, we're all dead. And it's dramatic in a way, but the point of it was he said this in the midst of the Great Depression and the onset of World War II. So if your house is on fire, you're not interested in remodeling your kitchen and putting on a new deck. You're interested in putting the fire out so you have a house to actually work with in the future. And so Keynes was focused on those house on fire moments. And I think this also makes sense in terms of recapping what we talked about with long run economic growth. Reason why certain countries aren't improving their standards of living is they don't have the luxury to focus on the future when the current existence of their nation is in crisis or unstable or unstable. There's political instability, health instability, educational instability. If you don't have that infrastructure in place and you have consistent problems or disruptions, then it's hard to focus on the long run. And so Keynes was interested in seeing, okay, what are the things that and the ramifications of short-term fluctuations, and are there ways in which we can visualize this, understand this, and then possibly come up with ideas to solve it. And so Keynes didn't draw a graph. In fact, there's the ASAD model is more recent. There was the ISLM model, which represents money, liquidity, and investment and savings. That's what the abbreviations come for. Basically, looks like the ASAD model, but it's got a little bit more technicality and nuance to it. That was developed by John Hicks after Keynes was dead, I believe. So Keynes wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, came out in the mid to late 30s. And so a lot of these ideas that we talk about in this class were just kind of written in a book in a very convoluted British English kind of way for the time period. And so it's an interesting read if you're deep into macroeconomics, but even if you are, the language can sometimes be cumbersome, not because you're incompetent in your vocabulary, but it was a very heavy-handed write. So anyways, here's the long-run aggregate supply curve. So here's a fun little animation showing, okay, this is from 2011. Basically, if the economy was at full employment in 2011, which it wasn't even close. I think unemployment was still around 8% at that point, but and I think the estimated full employment level was about 4.7 or 4.5% at that point. But if we were actually there, given the level of technology, the level of human capital, the level of amount of workers we had, and the physical capital that we had, $14.3 trillion was the estimated amount of real GDP that would be produced in the United States in that given year. But notice that if the price level changes, the level of GDP is unaffected at that point, operating under the assumption of full employment. And the reason for this is because of the fact that the classical theory says that basically any upward pressure in wage is going to be offset by an upward pressure in price. And now in reality, that does happen, but it doesn't happen consistently and instantaneously, which is what kind of helps us derive this short-run aggregate supply curve. But the theory is kind of in the long run, as technology becomes so hyperactive and efficient in terms of, and there's a clear level of information, that basically every price change offsets a wage change and vice versa. Every wage change offsets a price change. And so everybody is left with the same real wage and purchasing power at all times at that point. It doesn't matter if the price level is 600 or 90. your wage will fluctuate to offset that, and you'll ultimately end up with the same purchasing power. Talked about this in the inflation discussion. But is that really the case? Not really, so we'll get into that in terms of short-run aggregate supply. But as time goes on and we innovate and we come up with new technologies, we become more efficient, and we have more tools that allow for us to be more productive over the same period of time as we were before, you end up getting this shift to the right of long-run aggregate supply. So even though the macroeconomy in the United States was still nowhere near full employment in 2012 and 2013, because of the innovations that we were making, the potential of GDP rose from $14.3 trillion to $14.6 trillion, up to $14.9 trillion. Did we necessarily produce at that level? Probably not, because we had a substantial amount of cyclical unemployment at that point. But just because we aren't at our potential GDP doesn't mean that our potential GDP can't go up over time, because that we're constantly innovating, constantly coming up with new ideas to be more productive and efficient. And just because we have some sort of short-run thing, which is what the Keynesian theory will help kind of resolve, doesn't mean that we can't actually have higher levels of potential over a given period of time, even if we're not producing at that level. So how does this long-run aggregate supply curve shift? Well, there's three major determinants, even though I've listed four. The three major determinants are effectively technology, the physical capital stock that's available, and the number of workers that are available. So generally speaking, over time, your real GDP can be higher if you have more people that are able to work. So if your population goes up, naturally your GDP can go up. But to me, I'm more concerned with, so I would group these two together and say, okay, one way in which it can improve is if there's more people, but if they don't have the level of know-how and human capital to do the jobs that the future demands, then there's a limit to that. So I group together with that improvements to human capital. So again, our whole long-run chapter and discussions and units, we're all about talking about these improvements to technology, improvements to overall physical capital, improvements to human capital. So if we're educated, we're innovative, and we have the tools that we need to succeed, then we're much more productive as laborers and much more productive as an economy. So all of those things continuously improving over time is what is allowing for real GDP to go up, or that potential real GDP to go up. But as we'll talk about, this stuff also helps now. So it helps us in the future in terms of achieving higher standards of living, but it still helps us now. So if someone gives me a hammer or I get an education, yes, will it make me more productive in the future? Yes, probably. But it's also going to help me do my job now. So please keep in mind that these variables not only affect the long run, but they also affect the short run in a positive way, assuming that they are positive improvements. Which brings me to talking about the short run aggregate supply curve. So LRAS stands for long run aggregate supply. SRAS stands for short run aggregate supply. So the short run aggregate supply curve is going to be upward sloping rather than vertical, because there are some assumptions that are different in the Keynesian model than the classical model. So the three major ones are sticky wages, slow adjustments to wages, and sticky prices. So what sticky means is that it's not changing instantaneously like the classical model would assume. So wages are sticky partially because of contractual agreements. So in my position as an educator, if I'm a full-time contractual employee, the adjustments to my wage rate don't happen instantaneously. So if prices go up in the economy, gas prices go up 20%, food prices go up 15%, my rent goes up or my mortgage goes up by 10%. I don't get a cost of living adjustment for that. I get a cost of living adjustment when the contract resets in the following academic year. So is my cost of living adjustment higher than or lower than my increased cost of living? Potentially. It could be higher and I actually have a higher level of standard of living or purchasing power. It could be lower and my purchasing power goes down, but I have a higher nominal income. But it doesn't change overnight, so there could be fluctuations where I teach extra classes or do extra work and committee work and things like that that I get compensated for at some point during the year, but it's not really but that was contractually agreed upon in terms of how much I was going to be compensated for that before. So if I do the same thing again in the following year, the amount of money that I get paid extra that I might be for doing the same work in the following year is going to not kick in until that new contract year is implemented. So as a result, my wages are sticky. So there is going to be this intertemporal type of situation where my actual purchasing power is going to go down before that eventual reset of the contract. And that kind of flies in the face of the classical assumption where everything is fluctuating all at once. But if you take economics deep into your educational attainment, maybe you major in it, maybe you major in it, or you come back to it later on and decide, you know, I'm going to get a master's in it because it seems like a good field. You'll see that a lot of the research is making what are known as heroic assumptions. So some heroes wear capes, and economists make heroic assumptions. So a lot of economists might use a classical model to base their assumptions on, that we're all these hyperactive, rational actors that instantaneously adjust our budget constraints and utility functions, and prices change right away and wages change right away, when that doesn't really happen in reality. So one of the critiques of economists is that we do make heroic assumptions, but usually the counter argument for that is if we don't, then there's really nothing to analyze, and hopefully with that assumption we can kind of glean some information to get us closer to the truth than just kind of guessing and flying blind. Secondly, firms adjust wages slowly. So again, it's not instantaneously. So wages could be sticky because of your contract, but they could also just be slow adjusting because the firm kicks dirt around and lollygags until they kind of are forced to pay you more, whether it's because of a tight labor market where, well, minimum wage isn't going to get me the workers that I need. Maybe it's not even the workers that they need or that they want, but it's the workers that they need so they at least can stock the shelves and operate in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not to its full level of efficiency, but at least the door's still open and they're still making revenues because they're actually producing and selling things. But generally speaking, people don't instantaneously get pay bumps as a result of the market conditions changing. So that's something that is not baked into the classical model. And then the last one speaks to sticky prices. So we talked about this in the context of inflation. Menu costs make prices sticky, which means that firms are going to be slower to adjust their increased costs, their prices, due to increased costs of production. So again, there's a double whammy there. If you increase the price, that decreases the quantity demanded for the product, because that's just the law of demand. And then secondly, the firm actually has to pay money to change the menus and to inform the public that the prices are different. So there's these intertemporal things that, like, kind of static things or frictions, as economists like to call them, that essentially allow for these types of Keynesian type of effects to be measured. Otherwise, they would just use a classical assumption. And like I said, some heroes wear capes, and economists make heroic assumptions, and then we think we're heroes, but we are not. we're not saving lives, and hopefully some of our research can help contribute to saving lives, but a lot of it is just kind of us looking to the sky and wondering some question and then answering it and spinning around in our spinny chairs in our office and typing a bunch of numbers into statistical packages and getting some output and writing a paper about it that nobody ever reads. But it gets us to tenure, and then we can coast into retirement. And so, if that sounds wonderful, then you should be an economist. And if the tenure and coasting and retirement, spinning in your chair sounds wonderful, then get into academics. But it is not as unicorns and rainbows as it seems. It is a pretty harsh profession, because everyone is very interested in being strict and literal and making sure that everything is being pushing in the name of pushing things forward and not going backwards, and not providing some sort of false narrative that manipulates or deceives. So, but academics is a wonderful and rewarding profession, and being an economist is fun. I enjoy it a lot, so do that. Now, what determines the short-run aggregate supply curve? These are three variables that uniquely affect short-run aggregate supply, because we're operating under those sticky prices and sticky wages assumptions. And so if you're operating under those assumptions, you're going to have the upward sloping supply curve instead of a vertical supply curve. And so the long-run aggregate supply curve variables will affect short-run aggregate supply, but not the other way around. These short-run aggregate supply curve variables will not affect long-run aggregate supply. So the first one is expectations of future price levels. So this is exactly like it was with expected future prices in regular supply. If you believe that the prices are going to be more expensive in the future, then you're going to cut the available amount of supply that's available right now, because you want to get that higher price as a firm producing. So if there's a expectation of prices to be higher in the future, current supply in the aggregate economy goes down. If it's the other way around, then if firms believe the price is going to be lower in the future, then they're going to ramp up supply and production now. The second variable speaks to when those sticky wages and those sticky prices actually do change. So instead of it just being this constant flow of changing prices and wages like the classical model would assume, every year or every academic year, every few months or every few weeks, the firm will then change their price, or they'll change the wage rates and the salaries of those who they employ. And when that happens, then there's this kind of one-time shift of everything. So if they're cutting wages or they're lowering prices in some way, shape, or form, then that's going to result in a shift to the right of aggregate supply. But most of the time it's a shift to the left in aggregate supply, because they're usually paying more in costs and production, which results in a decrease in supply, or they're paying their employees more, which increase their overall cost of production, which results in lower supply. Last but not least, this last one is very important, is supply shocks. So the second variable we talked about in regular old market supply that would affect supply, first we talked about technology, and then we talked about prices of inputs, or effectively the cost of production. Now, in the context of a specific market, we can talk about the price of one specific item or one specific piece in the supply chain affecting that specific product. But now we're in the context of the macroeconomy. It has to be something that's going to affect everything, because if it isn't, it's not going to have a big enough impact where we can actually measure it and visualize it on our graph. So a supply shock has to be an unexpected change in the price of a key resource, or the supply and availability of that key resource. The biggest example of this is oil, because oil is kind of the fossil fuel that permeates all industries, because not only do people have to use it to produce certain goods and services, but they also need it to be able to transport their good or service to the requisite location in which it's going to be sold. So, if there is a significant increase in the price of oil or some other key resource that most industries use in the macroeconomy, then that is going to put upward pressure on the cost of production, which is going to result in a decrease in overall supply. And that'll shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. If there's a significant drop in the price of that product, that's going to put upward pressure, decrease the cost of production, which is going to put a increase in aggregate supply and an increase in production and shift that aggregate supply curve to the right. So during the Great Recession, oil prices shot up to $140 a barrel. Gas was over $4 a gallon. That was a negative supply shock. Within a year, gas was down to oil was down under $30 a barrel, and gas prices were under $2 a gallon. And then in 2020, with coronavirus, well, actually before coronavirus, there was a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia. So those are both OPEC nations, the oil and petroleum exporting country nations. And as a result, they decided, you know what, we're having a disagreement, so we're just going to flood the market with oil, and it put oil prices substantially lower, which put lower prices on gas prices. So gas prices fell from their steady states of somewhere in the mid $2 range to under $2, and in some places under $1. So supply shocks are pretty significant. So again, if we increase the labor force of the capital stock, those are improvements to long-run aggregate supply, but also short-run aggregate supply. If we increase our productivity through improvements in human capital or technology, it's going to increase long-run aggregate supply, but also increase short-run aggregate supply. If there's an expected future increase in the price level, then firms are going to cut their production. So that's going to shift things to the left. If workers and firms are adjusting now to their new prices or to their new wage rates, then we're going to shift short-run aggregate supply to the left. And if there's an increase in the expected price of an important natural resource, that's known as a supply shock, so an increase in oil prices, we're going to shift short-run aggregate supply to the left and indicate a decrease there. So let's put it all together. When we put it all together, we have 3 curves instead of 2. So naturally, like before, when you intersect the upward sloping supply curve and the downward sloping demand curve, the point where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded is going to yield us our macroeconomic equilibrium. And the thing is, though, is that doesn't solve all of the questions. That tells us where we're at, but we want to know, is that good enough? And if it's good enough, then the intersection point of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is going to intersect and create that point at the point where the long-run aggregate supply curve is. If that's the case, we have what's known as our long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And our long-run macroeconomic equilibrium implies a few things. Again, the long-run aggregate supply curve represents full employment, potential real GDP, we're operating at capacity at full employment, and our level of human capital, technology, physical capital stock is being realized. That is ideal. That is what the Federal Reserve is aiming for. That's what the government's aiming for. It's what everyone's aiming for. But there could be points where there's cyclical unemployment because we're coming out of a recession or some other reason, And short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand can intersect at a point that's below long-run aggregate supply. And if that's the case, we have what's known as a GDP gap or a output gap. The amount of output or GDP that we're trying to achieve is less than where we expect to be. And then we could also have what's known as an inflationary gap, where there are temporary periods where we might be beyond full employment, and we're actually producing at a level of GDP that is beyond what we assume to be our potential GDP. Maybe it's because certain factories are operating over capacity, or more people are employed than is forecasted at the level of full employment. So in 2018, 2019, the level of unemployment was forecasted for full employment to be 4.5%, and the unemployment rate was 3.4 to 3.7% over those 2 years. So we were operating at a point of level of GDP that was higher than potential GDP. That changed quickly in 2020 with COVID-19 and all the and oil price factors. We were already nearing the peak of the expansion, but once all that happened, it kind of just triggered us to be, instead of beyond our potential GDP, to be well below it. So again, the reason why this is so important is this point right here where all three are intersecting is the benchmark. That's where we want to be. So where SRAS and AD intersect, where the quantity of short-run aggregate supply equals the quantity of aggregate demand, that is our actual macroeconomic equilibrium. That's where we're at. But when it intersects with LRAS, that is a long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, and that is what we are trying to achieve. Ta-da! So I want to finish class in this lecture by going over some types of examples with this graph to kind of give you some context as to what you're looking for. So we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. The equilibrium point is going to be where they intersect. So this is our macroeconomic equilibrium. So again, remember, there's a macroeconomic equilibrium where we're at, and there's a long-run macroeconomic equilibrium that we're trying to achieve. And so I don't want to call that Q star because this isn't Q, it's Y star, because it's our actual level of GDP experienced in the economy and the actual average of the prices of goods and services in the economy at that equilibrium point. So, ta-da, that's the answer, but that's not the end of the analysis. We're forgetting something. We need our long-run aggregate supply curve. And so our long-run aggregate supply curve is here. This represents what is known as Y sub P. So Y sub P is our potential GDP. So again, that operates under the assumptions of full employment and capacity, etc. Forecasted out to be, okay, this is where we think that the economy could produce given all of the potential that's available and the innovation that's available, all the resources that are available. You could almost liken the long-run aggregate supply curve to the production possibilities frontier. So basically, if you're operating on this line as an economy, so like say this is capital goods, so we'll call it K, not X. We'll call this labor goods. Draw a normal L here. If we're operating on the line here, that is basically different combinations of GDP that would allow for us to be at our equilibrium where it intersects with LRAS, and that is a long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. If we're operating here instead of there, where YP is, this means that Y star is less than YP, and we have what's known as an output gap. So we have a level of inefficiency in the market and in the economy. So an example of that would be like we were operating here on the production possibilities frontier. We're falling short of what we are trying to achieve overall. So firms can adjust their wages and prices. That results in a shift in short-run aggregate supply, which would cause this to shift to the left. And whenever you have changes, you have a new equilibrium. When you shift the curve, you have a new equilibrium. So now we have even higher prices and an even bigger output gap. So how do we solve this problem? Well, this is where economic policy comes in. So we'll start over again. We have a situation where we are experiencing what's known as an output gap. So here is Y, PL. Here's our macroeconomic equilibrium point, but here is where long-run aggregate supply is. So what we want to do is we want to end up at a point where the short-run aggregate supply curve intersects the aggregate demand curve at long-run aggregate supply. So an example of this would be like so. We want 82 in SRAS and LRAS all to intersect here. This would be an example of a long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So we are at YP, and then we're at this price level. So we're here, we're here, we're here, and everything's great. But how do we get there? So the ways an aggregate demand curve could shift to the right, increased expectations of profitability, lower value of the dollar, probably not ideal. How do we control for that? Higher prices in the rest of the world, we can't control that. We could have lower interest rates or lower taxes or increase in another component of GDP, which is government spending. If any of those increase, decrease in taxes, increase in spending, decrease in interest rates, that's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Well, all of those are, interest rates can be affected and consumption and investment can increase on their own and organically. But if we're in a situation with an output gap, typically those things can be solved through economic policy. So if we lower interest rates, shift the curve to the right. Lower taxes, shift the curve to the right. Increase spending, shift the curve to the right. So those are examples of expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, and the ultimate goal is for them to intersect here and achieve that level of macroeconomic equilibrium. We'll talk about this in a lot more detail in terms of the policy units. So our next lecture will talk about money, what it is, how it's measured, how it works, why it's useful. Then we'll talk about the Federal Reserve System and central banking and talk about monetary policy in more detail to see how this actually works. Then we'll talk about fiscal policy and understand kind of what the government's role in all of this is and see how that affects policy and how whether or not they're balancing their budget or if they're taking on deficit spending or accruing a high level of debt, how that can have ramifications both in the short term and in the long term. And that'll pretty much wrap up most of the information for the course. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, good luck on any assessments that you have for this class or any others. And I look forward to talking to you soon.